Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode we're going to be talking to Lynn Mally about these two really fantastic books. So we've got Culture of the Future, Proletkult Movement in Revolutionary Russia, and we have also got Revolutionary Acts, Amateur Theatre and the Soviet State. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to talk to Lynn Mally about these two really fascinating books. So we'll go into a little bit more about that in a bit. So the session was recorded in as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-garde Art Practice and Research Group, which meets regularly. This session was recorded online, but from the 1st of February 2022, we're going to be having hybrid sessions. So if you're in Brighton, but you're based in Brighton, UK, you can join us in person. If you're not and you want to join us, you can still sort of join us via Zoom. So generally the sessions sort of explore the sort of history of the avant-garde in general, but also trail off into different topics. So the history of the avant-garde, radical counterculture, radical politics, and many other areas that sort of seem to be relevant for a general exploration. So they will be happening again very soon, every 3 weeks. In the meantime, here's a session from the 18th of May 2021, where we talked to Lynn Mally about the Proletkult movement and amateur theatre in revolutionary Russia.
This organization called the Proletkult, which was a kind of abbreviation for a very long-winded proletarian culture organization. It started right before the October Revolution, so it really grew out of factory committees and clubs associated with factory committees, which were the most radical working class organization during the revolutionary period. So there were unions and there were party groups, and then there were these factory committees that were actually trying to take over factories and manage employment for the working class. So it started in what was then Petrograd, later became Leningrad. It spread exponentially across the country during the Russian Civil War. So that was essentially from 1918 to 1920. And then in 1920, the country was destitute and the Bolsheviks barely establishing their authority. And they cracked down on this and many other institutions, first of all, monetarily, and secondly, as a means to gain political control. So you might know eventually by the 1920s, throughout the 1920s, all institutions that had any kind of independent political power, like cooperatives and labor unions and things like that, were eventually put very much under central government control. So my book studies mainly the early period when this organization became a mass movement. And I'm interested in why, because first of all, we know there aren't that many industrial workers in Russia, right? It is mainly a peasant country. And yet this organization spread to places where there were hardly any workers. And I wanted to know what they did in the organization, how it was organized, how it was controlled, who joined it, and what they performed, what they put on, what kind of organization was it? As I said, I think in the warm-up that the Soviets studied this organization primarily because it had its own, at least the leaders had their own political philosophy that said that power in the Soviet state should come through three independent paths. One was political, that would be the party. One was economic, that would be the labor unions. And one was cultural, And they said that would be the Proletkult, that this organization would be the mode of proletarian power within the proletarian state. And this philosophy, even though it wasn't necessarily understood or followed by the people involved, led to a tremendous hostility on the part of many party leaders. And eventually it was not destroyed, but undercut, and existed as a very tiny kind of elitist organization throughout the 1920s until it was finally smashed in the 1930s, along with all other cultural organizations when Stalin created socialist realism. So that was my first book. It was on an organization, nice and tidy. But what the Proletkult became best known for was its theater. And so, and because it was an organization of amateurs, this led me into a study of Soviet amateur theater, which was a huge thing in the early, in the revolutionary years in the 1920s. So my second book, Revolutionary Acts, is trying to trace this very large and amorphous network of amateur theaters and look at the basic interactions between amateurs and professionals and amateurs and the government. And my main thesis is that amateurism, as it was conceived in the early Soviet years, was something that wasn't tremendously easily controlled. And this, once again, led to friction with the government and eventually evolved into a kind of Stalinist amateurism that was much different, that was much more circumscribed and controlled. So that's what I did in my second book, which was a heck of a lot harder to write because it was, the topic was very amorphous. I mean, when you deal with an organization, you have help, right? You know, the organization, it starts and ends, it has archives, usually, one hopes, whereas things like amateur theater in general is a much harder thing to look at.
They're both really brilliant books as well.
Thank you so much. I'm so amazed people are still reading them. I mean, they're old, so I'm really flattered that they're gaining an audience.
No, I found them really, really helpful and really, really interesting to sort of get into, actually. Especially, there's something really good about the Proletkult book because it actually just has a lot of really useful information about the movement itself. Because I've been reading a lot of Bogdanov, as we were saying earlier, but actually I haven't found so much information about the actual movement. So it was really, really
right.
Actually go through your book. And also the links with amateur theatre and that whole project broadly. It sort of really helped me understand, I think, theatre, early 20th century theatre more generally, I think. Max was mentioning Brecht earlier, and I think that's the sort of, those sort of people that actually, it helps you see these kind of connections.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, you know, in history, it's always hard to determine where things exactly come from, right? And some people argue that Brecht's ideas are all Russian, right? That they came through Theatrical, one of these avant-gardists, to Brecht. I mean, I don't know if it's that useful to try to say who's first and who's not. In some ways, the whole idea of agitational theater is sort of, it seems to me, organic to political. If you're going to make political action, if you're going to stage political action, then the ideas of agitprop are pretty organic to that, right? You have to do it in a hurry. You're going to be poor, right? You don't have a bunch of costumes. You don't have time to make things beautiful. You're trying to get the audience to do something or see something, not just enjoy themselves. So all of those methods, like, they could have come from anywhere in a way, right? And they probably, I mean, if we did an international study, we could probably find them pretty much everywhere.
So in the introduction to your second book, you note that Soviet amateurs were not separate from the world of work in the same way as their capitalist counterparts. Western amateurs often justified their activities as a way to maintain a spark of individual expression within an increasingly regimented capitalist economy. By contrast, Soviet advocates argued that their style of amateurism revealed the superiority of the socialist system. In their free time, Soviet citizens turned to edifying activities that raised the cultural level and facilitated collective interactions. So what made Russian amateur theatre unique was that, like the Proletkult movement, it was grounded upon ideas of a newly empowered worker and the construction of a culture of the worker. How did these ideas of the worker shape early Soviet culture?
Yeah, I looked through my the Proletkult book, well, both of them actually, and I think that there is a strain in Russian thought, and it's both in thoughts about the Russian working class and also thoughts about the Russian peasantry that have a notion of collectivism in them. The Russian peasant was organized into a peasant commune, and the commune, this is before the land was redistributed in the mid-19th century, but the commune decided collectively what to do with the land. It was often farmed collectively and all the rest of it. So there was that notion of collectivism within the Russian peasantry. And Bogdanov, if we're talking about Bogdanov, believed that collectivism was the creation of industrial labor. That when you worked in the factory, you had to watch what other people were doing. You had to gear your work towards other people. And so therefore you have this kind of collective mentality. So the notion of gathering in a collective, and that it had a meaning to be involved in these projects beyond the individual, I think was very much part of the Russian socialist, broadly conceived socialist mindset. And even the Russian intelligentsia, I think, had a notion of public service that was unusual for an intelligentsia when I compare it to the educated people, say, let's say in Germany or even the United States. There was this notion that Russia was a repressive society, that the government gave privileges to the upper class, but kept privileges from the lower classes, meant that many Russian intellectuals believed that their job was to serve the lower classes to make up for their class privilege. So in general, I think that brings a different mindset to the notion of getting together and producing something collectively, that it's more about the group project than it is about the individual project. Also, I mean, I don't know, I was just thinking about this when reading through all the stuff I wrote about gender. The Soviet system in general, and we could say this about Marxism, I'm sure some of you will contradict me, but there's a real hostility to private life, to family life, right? That the solution to gender problems is to get rid of the family rather than revise the family. So doing things for your personal satisfaction was really not something that you admitted to. I don't know how you felt, but you certainly didn't admit to in public documents if you were an advocate of the revolution or you wanted people to think of you as a proper revolutionary. So that was also part of it, right? That I'm not going into amateur theater to become a star, right? Or my daughter was involved in amateur theater for years. So what they say to improve your public speaking capabilities, you know, to become more, to learn how to project so people will take you seriously. These are not reasons that Soviets would say. They would say, I want to create something meaningful as a group. This is a group project.
And was this sort of connected in with like I suppose that the way that the Proletkultists sort of saw this project as the creation of a work that is very specifically tied with this idea of the worker.
Right. Yes, I think that, of course, people understood that word many different ways, right? What a worker was in the Russian context is a kind of fraught question, but definitely the idea was that you were going there to create a workers' culture or a new culture. You weren't going there to have fun. Well, I'm sure it was also fun. And maybe people went there because it was warm, right? And their houses were not. But you were going there to create something new. You were going there to create something valuable and meaningful that would contribute to the broader culture. And I don't think that that's ever how amateur, well, I don't know, maybe Jane can contradict this, but I don't think that's ever how amateur theater is explained in the United States anyway. It's always, you know, this is a fun project and you're learning a little bit about the history of theater or something like that, but you're not creating a new life, you know, you're not.
But I was going to say, within that criteria, did they get to do what they wanted? How controlling was that, or did they get to do what they wanted anyway? You know.
Well, it really depended. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to what degree were they really autonomous? That was a big word in that period, and particularly in the Proletkult. And yes and no, right? I mean, there were some groups, and this was certainly true. It became much more significant for the groups in the 1920s that really did create their own repertoire. They had outlines, you know, they would get kind of a basic structure, maybe might be printed in a theater magazine, but they could improvise from there. There were tons of improvisations done at the Revolution, precisely 10 days that shook the world, right? So you'd have a book, right? And you'd take the book and then you do whatever you wanted to from it. And pretty much no one was there censoring it because no one was there, right? I mean, especially during the Revolution, there was very little oversight because they were trying to win the revolution and beat the whites and establish a state. So, but some of these groups were led by, you know, your high school drama teacher, right? Who might have you putting on Chekhov. So it really depended on the local situation, what the groups were actually doing.
I mean, they had the ability, or they were allowed to actually produce everything, sort of do their own writing and their own script. Did they, or did they usually just take scripts?
It really varied. I mean, I think that in the Proletkult particularly, it really depended on what kind of resources they had, who was involved, how literate they were. Remember, I mean, Russia was an illiterate country, right? So some of the people who were involved, I mean, for the most part, they were probably literate young people, but not necessarily everybody. So, so you had a huge range of things going on. I mean, you had the Russian classics, so, you know, Chekhov and Flavizin and all these guys, and then you had Russian potboilers from the 19th century. There was a whole slew of, you had plays based on Russian peasant plays that were basically structures for improvisation. Then you had people putting on Walt Whitman poems, and you had people writing their own idea of the revolution. You had people coming up with their own version of the Civil War conflict in their towns. So there was no one thing within the Proletkult.
Is there known to be sort of good work? Did any of the work sort of stand out from what you found, you know, as good work? You know, they sort of came out of it, something that was noted, you know, was noted.
Yeah.
And
okay. So yeah, I mean, okay.
Reputation or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and this is what Russians would always say to me, oh, you're studying that horrible stuff, right? And yeah, a lot of it, of course, is, I wouldn't say horrid, but it's timely, and it's ephemeral, and it's not interesting to us now, right? But certainly there were very important people who went into the Proletkult and came out famous actors and famous directors. And so in that sense, good work. But you know, so if your job is to create a community, or to educate a community on the revolution, or to get someone to join a collective farm, then the standard of good work is completely different, right? It's not anything you would want to read today, but it might have been effective for its purpose. I mean,
that was always hanging over it right from the beginning, even before Stalin made it much more strict, was it? They always had these sort of economic sort of determinism criteria sort of hanging over it.
I don't know. I don't know if I would say it that way. Yes, certainly it was purpose bound, right? In that sense, I don't know if it wasn't really determinist in that no one was telling them what to do, right? At least initially, because there was no power. I mean, the state didn't have the power to tell them what to do. But it was certainly, I think for the most part, people said, we're not just doing this for our entertainment. We're doing this to build something, to accomplish something. And that is the purpose of our art or our production or whatever you want to call it.
So it's always quite sort of a bit social realist, even from avant-garde in that, I suppose, is it? Or is
no, I mean, the avant-garde itself was very,
orientated.
They had something in mind too, right? They were very purpose-oriented also. I mean, it just, their purpose was different. I mean, let's put it this way. I think for the most part, in the early Soviet period, people didn't consider art for art's sake. That was not a concept, right? You weren't writing for the ages, you weren't writing, well, maybe personally you were, but you weren't talking about it. You were writing for some purpose. And the avant-garde was trying to create a new way of looking at things, right? A new way of registering reality. And also social spaces and all the rest of it, because the most part they were sympathizers with the revolution in one way or another. But these people thought they were creating a new way to have culture. And that would be better, right? There wouldn't be museums, there wouldn't be some kind of, you know, you wouldn't have to get dressed up to go to the theater. It would be, you know, everywhere, and it would be part of life. You know, that whole notion of art into life, it's really part of the avant-garde, was very much, but it, you know, not in a fancy way, in a everyday way.
So in your book, Culture of the Future, which is your one on the Proletkult, you explore how the Proletkult movement emerged out of three competing projects. So the left Bolshevism of the, I'm not sure how you pronounce this exactly, is it the Period?
Period, it's hard to pronounce.
Yeah.
Call it forward, that's all it means.
Forward circle, yeah.
Yeah.
And the adult education movement,
right.
And workers' institutions themselves.
Right.
So how do these different elements pull the Proletkult in competing directions?
Right, so the ideological structure of the Proletkult was definitely this forward group of the Bolsheviks, and those are the people who really believed in a proletarian dictatorship, which, you know, was actually scuttled pretty early on in the Bolshevik project, if you think about it. And they believed that the proletarian dictatorship had to include a cultural component. And that cultural component would be an organization creating a proletarian culture. Now, the irony or the twist is that they actually envision this process to be very slow, kind of a Gramscian, you build proletarian intellectuals, right? And over time, they re-envision science and all the rest of it and culture. And they then when the revolution happens, they'll be there to take over. And of course, the revolution didn't happen that way at all. So there was this theory that was actually formulated for a very different social situation and political situation, but nonetheless remained incredibly important to a large group of the organization's national leaders. So they were formulating this idea of creating a proletarian culture that was different, completely different, or radically different from bourgeois culture. And then there was the adult education movement that was really led by precisely these intellectuals that I talked about, that had a notion of a social mission, that they had to share their privilege with the population at large. And that was partly funded to some degree by the government, but mainly in a series of locally and privately funded clubs and what were called people's universities and local educational classes that were usually for a fee. I mean, so workers would have to pay, or the population, and it wasn't just workers, obviously, the urban population, and to some degree the rural population, because these existed in small towns also. So they were very much what the Germans call Kulturträger. The Russians use exactly the same words, the bearers of culture. So they would be teaching literacy, but they would also be teaching Tolstoy and Chekhov and science classes, and teaching the elements of biology to the population. Sometimes with very pragmatic goals, right? To guard against sickness, to try to get people involved in public health and things like that. But nonetheless, it was very much of a top-down. The intellectuals decided the curriculum, and the population came and went. It's kind of a people's university, right? You have that in England, right? We don't have that here, but where there is a curriculum, but it's open to pretty much anybody, and you go and you learn. So that's the second strand. And the third strand is the cultural activities that come out of the trade union movement. And that is very similar to the kind of cultural activity that you see in European trade union movements, right? That unions form classes, and they form clubs, and they form sports societies. Well, that actually the Russians didn't really do that. Maybe it was too cold, I don't know. But they had all kinds of activities that you could do as workers, and theater and art were part of those activities. So these three groups, who were all claiming to give culture to the lower classes, some under the auspices of the lower classes themselves, and some not so much, really merge into this very chaotic organization in the early Soviet years that is creating this new culture of the proletariat, which is really a kind of mishmash of many different Russian cultural trends. I use proletariat in quotes here because there aren't many workers in Russia, right? There aren't many industrial workers in Russia at the time, but Russian socialism, its own brand of homegrown socialism, not Western European Marxism, had always included peasants in the worker class. They were all called toilers. So when people talk about creating workers' culture, well, actually, no one knows what they're talking about, really, because are they talking about only industrial workers, railroad workers, printers, or are they talking about artisans? Are they talking about peasants? Are they talking about secretaries? So it's one of the confusions that actually made the Proletkult into a large organization at first, because you could interpret what they said they were trying to do in many different ways. So that also accounts for why the activities were so different in different places. Because if you got one of these adult education divisions taking over, well, they taught the same thing they always taught. They taught Tolstoy, they taught Chekhov, they taught, you know, basic science. They taught piano lessons. They taught what they were doing before. If you got workers groups, then for the most part, well, they were a little bit divided, but then you got more people who were actually had this kind of workerist aesthetic. We're going to talk about the factory, how the factory is beautiful. We're going to talk about how peasants are evil, because most workers, well, not most workers, but at least those who were involved in this proletarian culture movement, worker brands, were interested in thinking and talking about the factory, but often had huge hostilities to upper class people. They didn't want teachers. They didn't want, you know, some expert from the Bolshoi theater coming in to tell them how to do things. And then you had the high level Proletkult people who were had really contradictory views, because Bogdanov, a well-off doctor, right? No working class person, him, had this notion that intellectuals like him would help workers, but help them discover themselves. So he wasn't just, you know, handing over knowledge. He was enabling workers to come upon their own knowledge, but only after, you know, they understood science and they could read Tolstoy, right? So there were just many contradictory factors involved, which is what made it so fascinating to me. I mean, as a social historian, that's how I came to it, not as a theorist. As a social historian, it was just fascinating to me to see how many different ways cultural power could be, you know, workers' power could be defined, because there wasn't any single way of defining it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's quite interesting because Bogdanov really sees it as this sort of camaraderie collectivism sort of emerging from the factory. So that seems like...
Yes, exactly, right, exactly.
But that's obviously in contrast with, say, an adult education group that's sort of wanting to more...
Take them out of the factory, exactly. But in some ways, you know, Bogdanov did too, because he thought that workers' ideology and their mindset would come out of the factory, but he also took them out of the factory and created these proletarian universities for an elite group. I mean, there were, by the time of the Russian Revolution, highly educated workers who had educated themselves by hook or by crook, who knows how exactly. And these are the ones that Bogdanov loved the best. And he wanted to take them out of the factory environment and put them in a kind of experimental educational environment where they would then come up with this new approach to science and culture that he really thought the revolution needed to succeed, to be a workers' revolution. Which, let's face it, the Soviet Union wasn't, right? By the time it evolved, it was no longer a workers' state. It was, I mean, workers didn't really have all that much to do with the Soviet state after the 1920s. You wanted to leave the working class. That was the idea of the Soviet Union, right? You wanted to become, I mean, it was sort of a social mobility state.
You know, when they were encouraged to do all these not work activities, you know, not be in the factory and do these like educational things in the theatre, did they give them sort of time off for that, or did they just have to do a normal long working day and then they would do that in the evening, or was there some sort of time off, you know, given to
no, I mean, these amateur theaters, and really all through the 20s, it was extra. It was extra,
was it? Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
During the Civil War, it was, I mean, in the early years of the revolution, it was not only extra, but if you were a director, you wouldn't even start with the same actors, you wouldn't end with the same actors you started with, because remember, this was a civil war, right? Armies were coming through your town and leaving your town, or you would get mobilized, or, someone would get killed on the front, right? So it was a very chaotic situation as far as a conventional director was concerned. I don't know, Jane, if you can imagine ending a play with 50% new people in the cast. So, but by the 20s, obviously it was much more tame. But even then, no, you had to come after work. This was extra. And that's why most of the people involved in these groups were young. They weren't married yet. They couldn't possibly, you couldn't really combine this with a family.
But I mean, in a way, it sounds like they sort of maintaining the long hours of capitalism that is required of
Maybe,
this
right?
worker. Yeah, so they're maintaining all that, but then they're bunging a bit of socialism on top of that, and there people are supposed to squeeze it in. You know, it doesn't seem very.
Of course, they would say that you're completely wrong, right? They would say that, you know, socialist labor is much different from capitalist labor, but
right,
yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, because I mean, long hours are sort of in Capital. I think what it says, long hours are a sort of characteristic of the long hours for each worker, and a sort of characteristic of capitalism. Yeah, they carried on with that.
Well, there's that whole interesting appropriation of Taylorism as well in that period.
Yeah, and actually the Soviets embraced Taylorism. I mean, it's sad when you think about it, right? That I mean, it's another way that I think that the goal of the collective supersedes the goal of the individual, in this case, in an oppressive way, right? Because if your goal is to produce as much as possible, as efficiently as possible, then maybe long breaks are not part of your game plan, right? I mean, as they say at Amazon, of course you can go to the bathroom, but it will impact your wage, right? So
it sounds like economically they were too weak. They weren't in a position to start being liberal. They had to just stick to the really strict, you know, production.
The justification, absolutely. And you can see it. I mean, they've got, if they're going to be a country, they're going to defend it, right? Then they need they need factories, they need goods, they need. I mean, Lenin said quite clearly in the 1920s, and this is one of his critiques of Proletkult. He said, you first have to master the skills of capitalism before you have socialism. And one of the skills of capitalism is coming to work on time, you know, actually doing your job. And after you've done that, then you can worry about how to reorganize your job to make your job more fun or more rewarding or whatever. So, yeah.
Could I ask what the reaction of like the kind of early Russian anarchists was to this sort of cultural movement?
Yeah,
because
Russian anarchists.
Because what you say, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of didactic or kind of ideological purpose behind it, and it's more about this sort of little autonomous, local, community-based cultural sort of outcrops, which to me sounds like quite an anarchist conception of perhaps like cultural movement and that kind of thing.
Certainly, and I do think that I mean, anarchism was really definitely part of the early Russian Revolution. I mean, there were towns that declared themselves independent countries during the Russian Civil War. I mean, this kind of centrifugal force was really very apparent and very, as far as the government was concerned, very dangerous. And yeah, I think you could say that, I mean, that's another strike against the early Proletkult, right? Because you could criticize it for its theory, right? That it had this idea that, you know, workers' organizations the cultural organizations should be as powerful as the Communist Party, which is what they were saying. So you could criticize it from a theoretical point of view, but you can also criticize it from a practical point of view. Is what you really have here is an anarchic mess, right? There's no common goal. There's no, even though people think they're working towards a common goal, the common goal is so vague that there's actually no common direction. There's no common, there's no person steering it. There's no that resources, if from the point of view of a government, are really being wasted that could be used in a much more productive way. So yeah, I agree. I mean, there was an anarchic element to it that was very frightening to some people, including in the Proletkult, which was no friend of anarchism. I mean, Bogdanov is not a friend of anarchism, in my opinion. I mean, he envisions an end goal that is much more, I think, allows for more visions of individualism than a Leninist goal, but he definitely has a pretty vanguardist way of getting there, right? Of, you know, picking the best workers, giving them the best education. And that's the way you get to the end product.
Just going to ask, that actually made me think of another sort of question, but I was going to ask about, because you spoke about Lenin's critique. So I was interested in like how I mean, you spoke about it in sort of general terms in terms of the party's reaction, but do we know sort of specifically sort of what the attitudes of sort of some of the senior figures that were? And then the other thing was hearing you talk about sort of the power of the cultural art, or this idea about having this very powerful cultural arm, made me think about organizations like the Lekra in Indonesia, who, you know, and I'm not and by any means a historian, but I saw a parallel just in that.
I don't know anything about that, so tell me about it.
Oh, well, there's a good article by the Tricontinental, who obviously people have different opinions about, but there's a good interview with a guy who's a member of it. But Indonesia obviously had the largest non-governmental communist party in the world before the sort of massacre, however you want to sort of term it, in the 60s. And part of that, it had the largest sort of non-governmental cultural organization in, well, some people say in human history, you know, this thing called the Lekra, which was separate to the Communist Party, but very much, you know, if you're a member of the Lekra, you're almost certainly a member of the Communist Party, like, but they were technically separate. And so I know just something about the idea of these sort of organs being separate, but both sort of very powerful in their own way. I don't know, it just reminded me of it. So I thought I'd ask if that was something which had come up at any point. Yeah. Sorry, that was two questions, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that, well, I think it's important to remember that the Bolsheviks really didn't know what they were doing when they took over, right? It was kind of an accident or a lucky break for them. And they had visions, many different visions of how the Soviet state was going to work. And by the end of the Civil War, so this really 3-year period of total chaos and danger and hunger and pretty much fighting for their lives, by the time the Civil War was over, the idea took shape that there was going to be one institution that was primary in the Soviet Union, and that was the Communist Party. And that was not obvious before the Civil War began. You could have gone many different ways, I think, right? But the Communist Party was a restrictive party. It was a party that had some degree of organization and control. And it was the party that was responsible for building up the state. And therefore, it really took over the state. I mean, so there is a state apparatus, but the state apparatus was not nearly as, well, had no power really compared to the power of the Communist Party. But that was really a function of the Civil War. That wasn't, I mean, you know, we weren't supposed to have a state, right? If we were going to listen to Marx, right? The state was going to disappear. Well, the state didn't disappear, and neither did the Communist Party. You ended up with this thing that was completely new, right? That no one had envisioned. And the Communist Party became very jealous of its power. And the Proletkult, I mean, the leaders, which don't really represent the organization as a whole, but they saw themselves as the equal to the Communist Party. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous when we say it now, right? Because the Proletkult, you know, at its high point had like and we don't even know how many, but let's say 400,000 people. Well, the Communist Party was much bigger, and the Communist Party actually had some control over who were their members, right? They had a long history of getting rid of people they didn't like, of creating some kind of vision and direction. And the Proletkult had none of this. So it seems a little ridiculous when you think about the great delusions of grandeur. But I think we have to remember that, I mean, no one knew what was going to happen. I mean, right? I mean, they barely taken power by accident. And, you know, they fought the Civil War that they sort of won by accident in a way, right? Because there was wars every place else. So it kind of was an improvisation. And by the time the Civil War was over and the dust had cleared, here was this organization claiming it had a huge working class membership, which, you know, it probably really didn't, but nonetheless, it was claiming it, that had a role for a guy who was Lennon's enemy. I mean, they were enemies. They really disliked each other and wrote books against each other. Well, then you get rid of that, right? Or you kind of legislate it out of existence. You cut its funding, you subordinate it to the government, you hand it off, so it becomes insignificant as a threat, as any kind of threat to the dominant party.
One of the things that makes Soviet culture really interesting is that it was largely state-funded. And yet the Proletkult, whilst being state-funded, also demanded
And justified itself based upon its own autonomy.
Right.
So
yeah.
How did the fact that this was largely state-funded, yet also worked independent from the state and the Bolshevik party, how did that sort of shape its trajectory?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, the government was handing out money to cultural organizations during the Civil War, just right and left. And I don't think that they really thought through the consequences of much of anything. I mean, the government itself was just establishing its own educational organizations, right? They're starting from nothing. So Proletkult got money, and I think that obviously that contributed to its scope insofar as it had one. Certainly instructors, the people who taught the classes in the Proletkult, you can read their memoirs, and many of them will say straight out, I came for the money, I came for the food, I came because the place was heated, right? So they came because the Proletkult had money to give them to be teachers, and that's why they were there. I don't think that, frankly, the Proletkult thought through, the leaders of Proletkult thought through the contradiction that you're talking about, that they were dependent on the government and yet criticizing, demanding independence from the government. You can imagine that it could have become a self-supporting institution, which institutions eventually do in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, local groups are funded by, like, union groups are funded with union fees, and you pay for a performance, right? I mean, it becomes to some degree self-generating. But I actually don't think the leaders really thought through the monetary implications of it. Yeah, that's a really good question. Why didn't they? I don't know. I guess they just figured this was a workers' state. They were workers' advocates, so therefore they should get money.
When you say it was an institution, it sounds a bit like it was quite fragmented, though.
Oh, very fragmented.
Yeah, and if you think of it like the word could be propaganda or something like ideology or something, that if it had a sort of competing ideology, say to the government, then it's very fragmented,
Yes, very,
it's not
very,
unified.
very.
The government's trying to get everything unified, obviously to defend themselves against whatever capitalism coming back and the whites or whatever and wanting to come back in. So
yeah, no, you're right. It was very fragmented. And some organizations that called themselves a Proletkult, it was just a new word. I mean, imagine how many new words there were. I mean, people didn't know what a Bolshevik was necessarily, right? They didn't know. I mean, the Soviets loved acronyms. So the educational institution was called Narkompros. I mean, this means nothing to most people, right? So Proletkult, it just seemed like it was probably something, right, that had to do with a new state. So let's apply for money. So they did, or they just called their new club Proletkult because it sounded good, right? It sounded like one of those new revolutionary words. So yeah, I think there was a lot of confusion and chaos, definitely.
I was just wondering, are you interested in, because I heard you sort of in passing in conversation distinguish between what how people were personally motivated to engage in Proletkult and etc., and something more like what you might call like public reasons, the reasons that they were willing to talk about in public with other people.
Yes.
I was wondering, are you interested in maybe the more personal motives? And a question title.
Oh yeah.
What sources are you interested in?
You know, it's so hard to get at that information. Of course, I would be thrilled to find out, because yes, you just get what people say, that probably what they think, you know, people want them to say. So a lot of the work I did in my book on Proletkult, a lot of the sources were questionnaires that were filled out by local leaders. On very bad paper, in very bad handwriting. I often had to ask people help to read it. And they would say, you know, why do you want to join the Proletkult, or why have you started a local Proletkult? And the answers are always almost always very high-minded, right? To aid the revolution, to, you know, raise the cultural level of my village so we can contribute to the Great Revolution. I mean, so they're obviously writing for their audience. You really don't get that much in the 20s. You don't get the memoir writing that are published like you do in the 30s. That becomes a kind of genre. And the memoirs that you get in the 20s, well, they're very ritualized, and they almost always go, I was horrible, it was downtrodden, and listen to how awful my life was under capitalism, and the revolution came and now I'm really happy. So you don't get any kind of personal reflections on exactly what they were doing in this period and what that meant to them. But I'm sure you're right. I mean, I'm sure that people also joined because, you know, they were shy, or they wanted to meet girls, or, you know, or they wanted to get out of the house. I mean, you have to imagine too how horrible living conditions were during this period. During the Civil War, but also in the 1920s, when, you know, millions of peasants were coming into the cities. They didn't have good places to live. This is the birth of the communal apartment, right? Where you got one room with your entire family and all the other rooms were filled with families. So getting out to a theater rehearsal might have been your only time that was somewhat quiet, right? If it was in a nice place, and by the 20s, there were some nice places, it might have been the only time you were in a clean place, you know? So yeah, I'm sure. I don't mean to say that, you know, they're a variety of absolute selfless people, but that is the rhetoric you get when you read the sources. And we know our sources are always limited, right? Always.
But you I guess you learn a lot about ideology, even from when people just express what they think people want to hear. You get a lot of that, learn a lot about ideology. But I guess if you want to compare it to Western culture, Western amateurism, you also have to factor those same constraints on your analysis. So I'm sure you do, by the way, but just like when people rationalize why they do theatre in the West, there's also ideology embedded in that.
Yeah, exactly. Fame and fortune. I mean, that for Americans, it's always, you know, I'm going to go to Hollywood and earn $1 million, and this is going to be my ticket to, yeah, definitely within the capitalist narrative. Well, the, you know, American dream narrative, definitely.
You also talk a bit about youth culture. I think it was when you're talking about Tram, maybe.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, as I'm ashamed to say, I don't really keep up with Russian scholarship anymore because I'm retired, but there was, and I'm sure there's even more interesting scholarship on Russian youth culture, and particularly in the 1920s, when there was a lot of interaction between the West and Russia, the Soviet Union. There were definitely what the Soviet leadership considered to be really dangerous youth cultures, right? That were hooligans who were obsessed with drinking. Most Russians are obsessed with drinking, but to excess, who were obsessed with the West, who listened to Western music and danced Western dances and all the rest of it. So part of TRAM, this is a youth theater associated with the Komsomol, which is the Soviet Communist Party youth organization. What they thought they were doing, or what they wanted to be doing, was create an opposite youth culture, right? A communist youth culture that was all about, being a good worker and instilling socialist values in their families, their backward families. So yes, there was kind of a battle of youth culture that was taking place in the 1920s. I mean, I'm sure there was always a battle of youth culture in the Soviet Union, but it was very visible, made visible in popular culture in the 1920s. In a way, it's not, and again, until the Khrushchev era, really. You didn't see it reflected in popular culture in the same way. The interesting thing about TRAM was, this is the 20s, I mean, it dies out in the 1930s, but it attempted to kind of make communism cool. So they incorporated slang and they incorporated kind of hip clothes. And so they were trying to show that you could you could be in the in crowd and, have a kind of all those things that young people are supposed to have, a new vision, a fresh start, all the rest of it. You could do it and also be in the Communist Party or be a sympathizer to the Soviet cause. Where by the 30s, these groups are not doing anything like that. They're all, they're all doing Chekhov by the 30s.
So I'm going to go briefly back to the issue of the Proletkult. So central to the Proletkult's project was the idea that the workers themselves would create a new culture. On the one hand, we can understand this as a form of vanguardism, but a sort of vanguardism that, in contrast with the Bolsheviks, attempts to create a vanguard drawn from the workers themselves.
Right.
Or on the other hand, we can sort of, we could see the Proletkult idea of workers' self-emancipation as something similar to maybe syndicalist or sort of council communist demands for sort of direct workers' control. So how should we understand sort of the Proletkult idea of the workers' role within culture and revolution?
Well, I think within the Proletkult, there were both of those ideas. And I think that even in the leadership, they fought over these ideas. And there was definitely a strain within the Proletkult that didn't want the involvement of anyone who wasn't a worker. And really distrusted elements outside of the working class. Whereas a leader like Bogdanov was proposing a vanguardist vision of, I mean, even narrower than just the working class. He believed you needed to create a vanguard, a cultural vanguard within the working class that was going to then take up the work of creating new forms of knowledge, a proletarian science. So it wasn't just, it was culture, culture as like an anthropologist would understand culture, not just plays and literature, but everything, language, science, home life, everything would be transformed by the proletarian revolution, but it wouldn't happen necessarily organically, right? It wouldn't just be workers left on their own. They would be picked out and guided and privileged. An elite within them would be privileged to do these things that would then benefit everybody. So even within the organization itself, there wasn't any understanding of which one of these visions would prevail. I mean, it's a problem with Lenin eventually in the 1920s understood the whole notion of the vanguard. I mean, he even separated it from the working class.
No, I was going to ask about. It's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned sort of youth culture, and it's quite. I was sort of curious, and I have no idea if there was anything about this sort of in your research or something you encountered at all. But like, you know, obviously there were people like Kollontai, and again, I'm not an academic or historian at all, but I'm vaguely aware of like women like that who are sort of pushing for. You know, for equal rights for women and greater like gender equality within the sort of young Soviet Union. I was wondering, did any of those concern, you know, were there women's companies? Was that something which came up at all when that was something being discussed within the context of the cultural organization? Sorry, that didn't quite make sense, but I
No, you make perfect sense. No, I mean, Bogdanov in his own way envisioned, and he wrote science fiction books, so he has a vision of a future that you can look at, and it certainly was one with gender equality. However, it is the Soviet vision of gender equality that eliminates the home, right? So that was the early, and certainly Kollontais idea, right? That all those jobs that the family does, educating children, feeding them, housing them, you know, doing laundry, all those things would be done by social institutions, and child rearing, right? And all the rest of it. So it was this, you know, shining vision on a hill, but in daily life, it had really very little influence, right? I mean, there were some housing projects that were created with cafeterias, usually very bleak and dismal places that you probably wouldn't want to go to eat your dinner. But it's incredibly hard to organize that. And it's incredibly expensive to organize it, right? I mean, replacing the family, well, as we know, I mean, the United States is horrible. All the things the family do, if you farm them out, it's just incredibly expensive. Childcare, amazingly. My mother is in a care home. It's, you know, it's twice as much as her income to stay there, right? She had to sell her house to go. I mean, you know, all these things that the family did, expensive to replace it. And the Bolshevik state never had the ability, and I think after a certain time, not even the willingness to replace any of these things. So you're left with the family, right? And most socialist theory, and certainly Lenin's variety of socialist theory, has an incredible hostility to the family. The family is the place where religion thrives and old backward values thrive, and children are oppressed by their parents, and in many Russian homes grandparents live in, right? So the grandparents, even worse, right? So what you get is a hostility to the family, and that hostility to the family really means a hostility towards women. So really the only women who are included in these groups are young women, and even young women are not really included in any great degree. And I mean, there are some lip service paid to, you know, we have to bring in women, but women were more likely to be unskilled labor or not in the working class. they were much more likely to be illiterate than male workers were. So it's a whole new issue, right? I mean, how are you going to create a new culture if you can't even read, right? So, or, you know, a culture that can be handed down at any rate. So, I mean, it's very, I mean, I think the Soviet solution to the family is already apparent in the 1920s, although of course it gets kind of etched in stone by the 1930s, where the assumption of the double burden is just, you know, that's just considered normal, right? So everybody works, but the woman does all the housework, which in the Soviet Union is huge. I mean, even when I was there, I did my research in the 80s. I mean, just, you know, getting your food and getting it cleaned and cooking it and waiting in line, you know, every store has 3 different lines. I mean, those were in the old days, of course, but it's a lot of work, right? And they're not washing machines, and you're doing your laundry in the sink, or you're sending it out somewhere. I mean, so it's a lot of work to do housework. And that really inhibited women's ability, even girls' abilities, right? Because it was assumed that if anybody's going to help the mom, it's going to be the daughter, right? It's not going to be the son. So no, they don't have a good record. Yeah.
Didn't they start up family benefit, you know, the child benefit? So they got paid child benefit, and that's how the sort of British welfare state, and it took a cue from that. It started in the Soviet payments for each child, you know.
Yes, no, and I mean, and to some degree, yeah, you're much better off being a working woman in the Soviet Union than you would be in the United States.
Encouragement, yeah.
They have creches, and they have, you know, they have after school care and all the rest of it, but you know, it's not enough, right? I mean,
they still had the old attitude maybe of the woman. It's not breaking the tradition of the woman job of the housework as well. Right. Like it's think that past that, yeah.
And the child care work for women, right? So, right, I mean, the notion of the female sphere in the Soviet Union was etched in stone by the time I got there. I mean, they would take us on these tours of high schools, and the boys went to shop and the girls got home ec, and you'd kind of say, well, why? You know, why can't you do that differently? Oh, why would you do it differently?
Well, I read something by Alexandra Kollontai, and I liked what she said, because she said things like, you know, well, you think about the way that they think of sort of single mums in Britain, and mums who have kids and they're out of wedlock, and that, they think of that as like really bad, and it's on the mother to bring that child up, this waste, you know, wasted sort of burden on the state and all that kind of thing. And she says all that in the statement, you know, and it seemed very, very modern, you know. And she said, well, we don't regard, you know, children as a burden. We regard children as a potential, as, you know, as producers and workers and all that kind of thing. I thought that was good. I mean, this thing of the antagonism to the family, you know, is just you could look at it as if it takes the burden off of the individual parent, or even the 2 parents, and makes it more of a group. You know, I think a lot of people would like it to be more like that, because there's an awful lot of pressure on parents, you know, as a family unit in our system. You know, so I don't know. There's 2 ways of looking at it.
I think there were definite advantages to what developed in the Soviet Union if we're going to compare it to what exists within the United States. I don't know the British system that well, where, you know, any early childhood education before kindergarten you pay for, and if you need to get childcare to go to work, you find it, right? And that was not the case in the Soviet Union. That they had well-developed systems where, you know, you took your kids when they were very tiny and they were taken care of, and all the rest of it. So that certainly existed, but all the rest of it, you know, who took the kid to childcare? The mom. You know, who got the food standing in the 3 lines? The mom. You know, so that didn't change.
Patriarchal structure, just as it was before. The old traditions that change slowly, which is what Proletkult talks about, the slow changing traditions. Those structures.
Right. They should have been blocked. They should have been.
It's also, there's a difference between the ideas of people like Kollontai and Bogdanov and their visions of what gender could have been, and then actually what actually.
Right. Yes, right. And they certainly, I mean, I think Bogdanov and Kollontai saw a kind of, well, I'm not exactly sure it was gender fluidity the way we would see it now. It seemed like it was more like women having the freedom of men, right? It was women shedding all the problems of being women. It wasn't anything about men, you know, assuming any of the traits of women, right? That men would become more nurturing, that men would take over some of the kind of housework or maintenance of the family that women did. But the Soviet, I mean, by the 30s, that's all gone. I mean, that is gone. So, you know, International Women's Day becomes Mother's Day, right? It's not celebrating women's.
Did I read a book? I read a book. I know you know better than me about it, but it sounded like the figures, the statistics in the Soviet Union was that some of those jobs that would be a man's job, like a sewer worker or something like that, women got those jobs, you know, so they didn't get those jobs.
No, I mean, and jobs that we would consider high class, like doctors, that was a female job in Russia, and it was a very low class job. No, I mean, the kind of the jobs that were high class were different, but the gender division was not different, right? That men had the job that were high class and women had the jobs that were low class. That was not different. You just put, you know, slotted different occupations into those hierarchies.
Is it true to say they had more like jobs that when men would have even in our system, sort of engineers?
But they had more workers, hard labor jobs. I think that's
for women, did they? Yeah.
So while the Proletkult movement, especially during the Civil War period, supported a variety of different types of theatre, I think as it developed, it sort of came closer to the avant-garde theatre sort of.
Yeah.
And even had, you know, theatres, pieces directed by Eisenstein, the film director, and stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
So what was the relationship between the Proletkult movement and the sort of theatrical avant-garde?
That's also very complicated, and it would depend on who you asked, right? I do think that it was particularly the Moscow Proletkult, and mainly after the Civil War, that came under the auspices of some elements of the Soviet avant-garde. And so did Tram, the youth theater, also had some ties with the avant-garde. And I think that in some ways there's a kind of natural affinity, because I mean, the avant-garde is also talking about new forms, right? New forms of expression, new forms of presentation. And so is the Proletkult, right? Or many of them are thinking that we're not just going to put on a play by workers and call it a workers' play. We're going to try to create a new kind of play, something new. And there was a hostility certainly within the Soviet avant-garde and within some elements of the Proletkult. There was a hostility to tradition, to Stanislavski, to you know, the classics, that a new time period required a whole new set of ways of doing things. So that was definitely the affinity. But there was also a lot of people within the Proletkult who had real hostility to the avant-garde, because they felt like it was effete and intellectual and difficult to understand, and way outside of the capacity of normal people to identify with, that there was no emotional component to it, no real beauty, and these are the things that would motivate people to respect and participate in a new art form. So that hostility definitely existed within the Proletkult. Bogdanov himself was no fan of the avant-garde, and Lenin hated the avant-garde. So it was
Lenin
really
liked it.
Huh?
I always thought Lenin liked it, quite liked it. Was quite.
He didn't like
he
it,
didn't
no.
love it, but he was
No,
very
he was a
sympathetic to
cultural.
it.
Well, I mean, he allowed it. I guess we could say
Yeah.
that. It was allowed in the early
Yeah,
Soviet
yeah,
state.
it was allowed.
But I don't
Quite
think,
good.
I mean, he liked Beethoven. I mean, he was not an experimenter in any way, shape, or form. The youth theaters of the 20s were more definitely linked to the avant-garde. But the Proletkult, it's up to not just in theater. So as you said, they were involved with Eisenstein for a little while. Tretyakov also took part to some degree in it. But they were also involved in music. So advocates of atonal music, the factory, there were these factory whistle concerts and things like that. They were also to some degree affiliated with the avant-garde. And also production art. So the notion that art shouldn't be a pretty thing on a wall in a museum, right? This was one of the notions of the avant-garde. Proletkult artists also got involved in doing things like, instead of, painting some painting, they would do banners, or they would make posters for trade union organizations or things like this. And they saw this as a method of creating a new kind of art that was a revolutionary art. All of that gets smashed by the 30s. All of that's gone by the 30s. But to some degree, it within the Proletkult in the 20s, which is tiny, right? And also within the youth theater movement, the avant-garde does have an influence until pretty late. Which, I mean, when you read Soviet scholarship about the avant-garde, which for a long time was very hostile, no longer, but for a long time was very hostile, you get this common statement that workers don't like abstractions, right? They want a story, they want a hero they can identify with, and the avant-garde didn't give them this. But if you read some of the responses to theater performances by workers, a lot of people had no trouble with it. I mean, there wasn't a story, but there was a message, they could understand the message. So it wasn't like you needed a hero necessarily to identify with.
Yeah, so there's almost an idea of what people think the workers want.
Yeah, oh, definitely, yes. And I think that, a lot of Bolshevik leaders thought they knew. Yeah, and they would tell you what they knew. They would tell you what they thought they knew.
Again, I don't know if this is particularly interesting, but what you're just saying about Lenin remind me of, I have, I don't know how this is pronounced, but Mikhail Shatov's maybe Dramas of the Revolution here, which was published in 1990. And these are obviously plays from the late Soviet Union. And there's one here called, it's just called Bolsheviks, but there's a scene where the Bolsheviks are all around a table and they reenact sort of senior Bolshevik figures all around the table, and Lenin is running late for the meeting. And they reenact him being taken around a gallery of futurist art and becoming progressively more appalled at every new statue before eventually sort of turning to the individual who is it? It's Anatoly Vasilievich. I don't know who that is, but the guy who...
It's not Lunacharsky? Is that...
Lunacharsky is here. Ask Lunacharsky. Yeah, it is Lunacharsky, yeah. And ask Lunacharsky, are any of these, do you think you're using any of these? And he goes, no, don't worry. And Lenin's very reassured. Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was interesting that in the sort of late Soviet Union in the 80s, there was still the image of Lenin and Lenin's perspective on abstract art was still I found
Yeah.
that really interesting. In fact, you were
Yeah.
talking about that.
It was fascinating. It is
yeah.
fascinating. You know, when I was a graduate student in Moscow, I was there in 81, 82, and they had at the State Art Gallery this show, Moscow, Paris. I don't know if you've ever heard about it. It's about the relationship in the 1920s between the Russian avant-garde and the Parisian avant-garde. And so it had Rodchenko and Malevich and, you know, the Black Square and all these things that I've, of course, read about a lot. And it was so fascinating to see the Russians look at it, because they'd never seen this stuff before. You know, it was perhaps, as far as we're concerned, their most amazing creation from the revolutionary period. And they had never seen it. It was really interesting. Because it was, you know, I mean, for many parts of Soviet history, that stuff was considered anathema, right? It was bourgeois, you know, claptrap.
This was after Stalin did his social realism.
Yes.
Yeah. They actually sort of banned it, did they? So they couldn't actually see it at all.
You couldn't see it. That's right.
Really?
That's right. And a lot of it was sold for
Yeah.
cheap to
Oh, yeah.
foreigners.
The chauffeur got a lot of it, didn't he? And
Yeah.
yeah, I've seen the exhibition. So it was 1934. They had that conference.
32.
That, like the famous conference where they went all.
Oh no, you're right.
realist.
34. 32 was the announcement. 34 was the conference. Absolutely right. Yeah. I'm a historian. I forget dates.
So one of the things that makes amateur theatre of this period really exciting is that the circumstances of the period and the ideas that surrounded them seem to bring about unique forms of theatre that were different to traditional theatre, whether that be agit trials, living newspapers, sort of trans-didactic theatre, or the shock work of agitprop brigades. How did these unique forms of amateur theatre come about, and why?
Well, I think that some of them came about just by necessity, that you wanted to get together and put on some kind of play, but you had no scripts, you had no props, you had nothing, so you improvised. Agitprop theater, I talked about it a little bit before. I think that came about for a specific political purpose, very focused theater. In my book on amateur theater, I talk about its existence. It props up during the first 5-year plan in Russia, where the government is trying to create this industrialization drive and also a collectivization drive. Thanks. And young workers or students, young people for the most part, take it into their heads to form a kind of theater that will make this possible, that will facilitate it. So they develop, for the most part, pretty primitive scripts with a conclusion in mind. So, for example, the first 5-year plan was financed by sending food abroad to the horrible detriment of the Ukrainian population, selling treasures, including the Russian avant-garde, to people abroad. But it was also financed by self-sacrifice. Workers gave up part of their wages to create the money for the industrialization drive. And this was done through a kind of, victory loan type campaign, right, that they have during wars, war bonds and that kind of thing. And these agitprop troops would come into the factory workplace, or they'd come into a cafeteria, or they'd come into a dormitory, and they would perform their play, their skit really, and demand then that people buy these bonds for the first 5-year plan. And if they didn't buy the bonds, they would make fun of them, or shame them, or even report them to the authorities. So it was a very activist-oriented, results-oriented kind of theater that was in some ways very brutal to the, I mean, I call it a war on the audience. I mean, it was a kind of use the audience as your changing the audience in an immediate way is your absolute demand from this kind of theatrical performance. So, I mean, you have, in the Civil War, you have, I think you have improvisation taking place for a variety of reasons, because people don't trust the old repertoire, so they're going to try to invent a new one, because they don't have scripts, or they don't have money, or they don't have a director, so they're improvising with that. By the 1920s, I think the improvisation becomes much more focused on tradition, on aesthetic principles, or political / aesthetic principles. What do you want to accomplish with your theater? And there are many different things that people want to accomplish with their theater, right? They want to entertain an audience. They want to inform an audience about a new political direction. So they decide that certain theatrical forms are better for that. Tram developed this sort of mixed media, you know, within the context of the time, presentation using sort of like rap songs, we would call them today. Russians call them chastushki, and acrobatics and singing and all kinds of things to attract the widest youth audience that they could. So that was definitely a theater that was developed to engage the audience, please the audience. So I think that this is one reason for the incredible aesthetic diversity in this period, is that people have many different ideas about what theater is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I really liked also some of the stuff you were saying about living theaters and living newspapers, and
yes, exactly, yes, right.
And the
so yes, that was exactly to inform a largely illiterate audience, right? And not only an illiterate audience. I mean, there wasn't much paper during the Russian Civil War. It's hard to publish anything, so the news would get acted out for you, and obviously with a certain direction, of course.
Just a little bit about sort of like the position on Lenin. He did visit Bruttimus, the higher educate design studios in Moscow in 1920, and he met the daughter of Anessa Imam, who was a student there. And one of the things, as he was going around, he kept seeing more, not futurist that per se, but suprematist, you know, the geometric shapes, the black, you know, and the proto-constructivist, because that came in 1921. And he stayed a lot longer than he should have. He stayed for 3.5 hours. And I think one of the things I just wanted to sort of make a little point, or just get your opinion on this, is that the Soviet / Russian propaganda is always trying to put a spin on that. So at the end of the visit, one of the things he famously says to one of the students there is, look, I'm an old man. I think he was about 60 odd or whatever. I'm an old man. I don't really understand all this new art. You know, I'm a person of the old age, you know, like basically I like all this realistic stuff. I like my Beethoven, as you would say, just before that.
Right.
He says, but basically just, you know, what do I know about it? Well, they've made a Russian film about that recently, that visit. But they had a little bit in which didn't have, well, there's no source for it. I can't find any source for it, but it's in this film, which sort of says, as Lenin goes away, he's all smiling, then he goes out and he finds a telephone, he says, stop the squares and blah, 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 close it down. Well, he actually, so I think there's always been that sort of propaganda of, like, Lenin didn't understand it. He spent all his time thinking about revolution, transporting it to the world. And also, a lot of the artists didn't really understand Lenin because they were artists. They spent all their time drawing squares.
Don't you think it? Yeah. Don't you think
Yeah.
Don't you think it's incredible that it was allowed at all?
Well,
It's very. I think if they allowed it, it's incredibly far-sighted, you know, for a time like that, really.
Well, there's one
You
little
have
thing.
to imagine that.
Even if you didn't like it, whatever.
But the
Well, there's
20s were really different. I mean, the 20s were a fairly permissive period in the Soviet Union, right? So it was, there were normal little stores in Russia. It's hard to imagine if you were ever there in the 80s. You know, they had little cafes and things that were privately owned. You could go back and forth to Berlin, you know, without asking anybody. I mean, it was a much more progressive, well, I don't want to say progressive, but it was there was a broader range of things that were allowed in the 1920s. Definitely. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's interesting that Lenin didn't say, you know, I'm in charge here. I don't like this. Let's shut this down. He didn't say that. That's true. But it was never in the highest regard in the
he didn't like it personally.
They didn't understand it. But you have to remember too that one thing about the avant-garde is they were pro-revolution, and there were a lot of artists who weren't. And you know, the state needs artists, right? So they were allies, and the 1920s was a period when the government was looking for allies, and they got it in the avant-garde. I mean, they were, you know, they were doing their best to propagate the regime and come up with ideas of making it interesting and, you know, reaching out. And they also, I mean, the Russian avant-garde also got the idea that how do you bring in the peasantry? Well, you involve peasant forms, and you know, you modernize, you recreate, you re-envision peasant forms that are in some ways familiar to them, but you give them a more radical look. So, I mean, they were inventive, the avant-garde, in ways that the more traditional artists, first of all, weren't necessarily sympathetic, but also were just doing the same old things, right? I mean, it wasn't like you could say, you know, this is the new face of the Soviet Union. You couldn't.
Well, I think his clothes are quite modernist, Lenny. He doesn't look very old-fashioned. So I always thought he kind of liked it.
He was pretty old-fashioned. I don't know.
I think he doesn't look old-fashioned. No, I think he looks quite like something you could be wearing now. You know.
Oh, I see.
Considering that's, you know, that's really beginning of the last century.
I've never heard any. That would be interesting. You know, once you start studying clothing, which I do now, you think things. One thing I know I would do differently if I wrote this book now. Where did they get their costumes? I am really fascinated by that. I mean, obviously during the Civil War, they pretty much, for the most part, didn't have costumes, or they were dressing up in sheets, or, you know, they were robbing the old theater of their stuff. But by the 1920s, when you look at those tram plays and things like that, and there's lots of good pictures of them, their costumes are very inventive. And I would really like to know who did them, you know, and where they got their stuff. That would really interest me. I wasn't asking those kinds of questions when I wrote them.
There's also the blue blouse costume.
And they were really fun. Yes, the blue blouse. So they were, so the blue blouse tram eventually went on to do plays, but blue blouse stayed in the kind of improvisation mode. So it's almost like an old music hall, except they Sovietized it. So they would have, you know, they would have singing, and they would have little, I mean, they couldn't have little movie clips, obviously, because they didn't have the technology, but they would have tumbling and sometimes juggling and you know, anything to make it appeal to a big audience. But their written texts were all about daily life. So, I mean, some of them sound incredibly boring, like introducing the new tax policy or things like that. But they were trying to make it fun, you know. So it was a mixture of, I guess, politics and fun.
Whose idea was it, Proletkult. Was it Lenin? Did you say it was Lenin's idea? I know you said Bogdanov.
No, Bogdanov.
Yeah, it was just Bogdanov.
Yeah,
but he didn't have to run it through by anybody. He just him on his own sort of thing.
You're imposing your image of the older Soviet state onto this revolutionary period, and it really doesn't make any sense. There was hardly any state, right? I mean, there was no one to ask permission of, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you were counter-revolutionary, if you said, you know, you wanted the Bolsheviks to be overthrown, you would get into a lot of trouble. But if you were just saying, I have a different view of how the revolution should work, for the most part, you were left alone until, you know, you wanted money or someone decided that your views were undermining of the government, then you'd get in trouble. But in the beginning, it was just too chaotic for anybody to take charge like that. I mean, Lunacharsky, who Jane talked about, he was the head of the State Cultural Organization, and he was a truly book culture. He was a broad-minded man who liked and appreciated the avant-garde. And Lenin just kind of left him alone for a while. You know, you're in charge of that. You do what you want. That's your bailiwick. You know about art. You studied art. I'll let you do that. And that was the original kind of, you know, you can't do everything. And the government might fall at any minute, right? So you don't really have time to be policing various parts of it.
It's amazing they tried to do anything like this, isn't it, really?
Yes.
It is amazing. You know, they allowed any avant-garde art, they allowed
put any money into it at all. Yes, I think that
it is amazing. But just talking about their clothes now, because we said that. So I'm thinking, Stalin, by comparison, I'd say Lenin looks fairly kind of modern. Must be a modern suit from the 60s or from now, perhaps, and the cap and the little hat. But I'm thinking the Stalin look, he went back to the sort of Cossack look. He's got more of the big moustache, and he usually wears those kind of sort of baggy, you know, baggy Cossack type thing. So that's more
or
social
the
realist
general look,
more of a peasant look, you know, back to the old social realism.
Yeah, because you're actually you work on fashion now, don't you? Anyway,
I do. Yeah, that's my thing now.
Yeah, which is just interesting. Interesting how it sort of relates. How do you fit? Do you feel like you would sort of how would you approach sort of Russian fashion if you would now?
Oh, I think it's fascinating. So if I were to study, so first of all, there is Russian fashion, right? I mean, you could train as a fashion designer. There were fashion magazines. There were obviously stores. At one point in the 1930s, I know a delegation of Russian fashion experts came to the United States to look at the distribution system in the United States. What I think is interesting is, and perhaps it's because of the Bolshevik distrust of the home, the private sphere, but consumer goods were never really high on the Soviet government's list of where to invest their money. So a lot of the work of fashion was actually done by individuals. So sewing was really important. And I remember, I wish I could get my hands on it now, but when I was in Moscow doing my research, so that was in the early 80s, you could buy these little daily calendars printed on very bad paper. So every day, you know, it had a little Soviet saying, it was the day of the railroad workers or something. They had millions of these days of the this and that. And on the back of some of them, they had tiny patterns, tiny dress patterns. You can imagine it was about because you guys have metric now, but it was about the size of a 3-inch by 5-inch card. And on the back, there was this minuscule pattern. And Soviet women had the ability, they had the skill to take this tiny pattern and blow it up into a full dress pattern. I mean, that's how good they were. And that's a hard, I mean, I'm a seamstress, that's a hard thing to do. So the the work of fashion was sort of privatized, right? I mean, obviously there was a fashion industry and all the rest of it, but Soviet stores were very depressing. So a lot of the work of keeping in style was put on women who knew how to sew. And Soviet women, I mean, I don't know now, but when I was still doing my research in the 80s and the 90s and the very beginning of the 2000s, Soviet women were very stylish. They might not have a lot of clothes, but they looked good when they went out. And that was a tremendous effort to find the fabric, to make the clothes or source the clothes, or, you know, have a network to get the clothes from foreign friends or foreign sources, to find the shoes. I mean, that was a lot of work, but they managed. They looked great. I mean, they could always tell. When I was a graduate student, the Lennon Library was divided. I mean, to talk about hierarchies, it was divided into different hierarchies. And if you were in the first reading room, that's where all the old Soviet professors were. They came in with their graduate students and they did their work. But for some reason, foreigners were allowed to work. And we were all graduate students, right? And we were poor and sloppy. So there were all the Soviet professors and their graduate students, often women, beautifully dressed women. And there were we, you know, in our jeans and sweatshirts, looking, as far as they were concerned, I'm sure, very scruffy.
They all wanted your jeans. Oh, Levi's or whatever. They thought they were magic. Yeah, they loved them. They rule the world.
So whilst the Proletkult was involved in theatre, it was also trying to build a more general proletarian culture that included music, literature, science, education, and daily life. One of the most ambitious projects was the construction of a proletarian university and a proletarian science. What was the idea behind this project, and to what extent was it realizable in practice?
You know, I looked at that again. It's an interesting question that you raised. So it was a very, very serious project to Bogdanov and that strain of the forward movement. I mean, that was really their idea. And it remained in the Proletkult throughout its existence in some small form or another. And even into the 1920s, this notion of proletarian universities and a proletarian science existed. As far as I know, really nothing came of it, nothing concrete, nothing was published, nothing, these proletarian universities didn't continue. The universities that did eventually emerge in the Soviet Union that served the working class were very conventional places that just had a little help for people who weren't very literate. But the notion, when people were asked to articulate the difference, was that bourgeois science, well, we know this now in critiques of science, right? That bourgeois science or capitalist science, to some degree or mainly, is developed to sustain the capitalist system, right? So all the money that goes into oil exploration or whatever, that our government feeds into these kind of scientific projects. Whereas a proletarian science would go to help the collective and not be used for profit value. So the one example that they said was that capitalist science would be used to come up with vaccines, for example, to cure illnesses, while the goal of proletarian science would be prevention. Instead of curing something that already exists, a bad thing that already exists, why not organize society around prevention and come up with ways to do that? So a different perspective. So they would always say, we're not contesting Newton's laws, right? We're not coming up with different facts, scientific facts. We're trying to use science for a different purpose.
more like political organization of science rather than science, isn't it? Because it's not like changing science, you know, what Galileo said.
Right. You're not going to, well, you know, I mean, to some degree, Stalin did, under Stalin, there were efforts to dispute scientific facts, but for the most part, no, right, that you would use it in a different way. I mean, I'm trying to think of,
well, an example of, in a way, is this thing about COVID, the way they've all explained the science in COVID. I don't know how you've had that in America, and you've got Fauci, he's pretty good, he's all right, but sometimes they're explaining these science facts, you know, these guys, and they're, we have a conservative government, and these guys are picked because they fit with those, you know, and they'll, and they have that science, you know, and it's all sided, you know.
Right. So that science isn't something, well, I think we all would agree with that, probably at least all of us, that science isn't something that's neutral, right? It's something that's used to a social end or a political end or an economic end. And they were just saying, let's wield this tool in a different way and maybe even reconceptualize what it is. I mean, Bogdanov was very much against, he was a kind of highly educated man with very many different interests, and he was against specialization. He was against things being shut off into their different kind of categories and people not talking together. And he imagined that in a real university, this kind of proletarian university, you would be grouped in a collective, you would talk about things, and this kind of interaction would create different ways to look at things. I mean, I don't know, now in the United States, for example, they, well, you know, our healthcare system is a terrible mess, but in the better hospitals now, they have a group approach to disease, right? So you'll have, if you have cancer, you'll have, you know, the cancer expert, but you also have the nutrition expert, and you'll have the social worker, and you'll have the physical therapist, and they'll all work together, right? They won't be, you won't get contradicting information from all these different experts. And I think that that was, in a crude way, a kind of Bogdanovist idea, right? That you're all working towards a single project, but you're working together to solve the issue. And that was sort of his insight about proletarian science. But, you know, it came to really, that aspect of it was the most, well, perhaps even the most difficult to bring about, right? Because to even start that conversation, you have to have so much knowledge, right? You have to be trained in basic scientific principles to even begin to start those conversations. So that never really happened at all.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about one of the things because you looked at some of the brief attempts to build a proletarian university in
yes.
And one of the things I thought was really interesting is the way you brought up, I think, you know, the workers that had maybe a session on different topics, but they would also have a session on the organization of the sciences.
Right, exactly.
Bogdanov's idea of technology and these.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. And also, I mean, they had notions of student participation that sound really, well, I mean, in general, the Soviets in this period experimented with lots of kind of student participation in education. So the students would say, we don't like the way you're teaching us. You know, we need you to organize it in a different way so it's more user-friendly, or there's more time for questions. And that was a different model of education that they were interested in. That's also part of this collectivist notion, right?
Mm. Is any of this including, you know, I've heard, you know, that they had an orchestra in every town in the Soviet Union, you know, so that, I thought that sounds really great, because, you know, that's nice, they had music. Is that part of Proletkult, or is that the same sort of thing?
No, I mean, I think it comes from, I mean, it's not Proletkult in any meaningful ideological way, but I do think that the Soviet Union took culture very seriously. and it was willing always to devote money to cultural enterprises, even a period like the Civil War or the Second World War, when we would have thought, use your money in a different place. They didn't. So no, it's really true. I remember in the Gorbachev era at my university, there was once, there were all these delegations coming through from Russia to show, this is the new Russia and everything. And there were some librarians there. And this one librarian raised her hand and said, do you have a library in your town? And the Soviet, it was some, academician, someone way high up in the Soviet hierarchy, and he said, that's the most depressing question I've ever heard. I came from a little town in the Arctic Circle. That's where I came from. And we had a library. Every Soviet town has a library. And you can't say that about American towns, right? There are a lot of American towns with no libraries. So, it is some, what is different from Proletkult, the idea was that these are highly, at least in the Soviet period, regulated places, right? That they would know what books were in the library, and they would know what reading groups, and that was not the case in the Civil War, that people would determine that themselves, but that they had an orchestra in every town, that I believe, or, something approaching an orchestra, if there were enough people in the town, that they had some kind of cultural activity that would include, some of my theater friends I got to know in Russia came from the smallest little towns. And they would say, the Bolshoi Theater came and gave a performance here. And that's where, no, seriously, that's where, I saw great theater for the first time in my life. That doesn't exist in the United States to any great degree. So there is, that is something that the Soviets did very well, I think, that they defined what culture was, right? The state, for the most part, defined the content. But the fact that it existed, that those opportunities existed, was a deep commitment of the Soviet state.
So throughout the period of the Civil War, the new economic policy and the first 5-year plan, both the Proletkult and amateur theatre went through numerous changes.
Right.
But the Proletkult movement sort of didn't survive the second 5-year plan, and amateur theatre would be sort of fundamentally altered.
Yes.
What made these projects incompatible with the Stalinist project, and what led to their demise?
Well, I think the basic theme that I saw with any cultural group with any sort of independence from the Civil War and the 1920s and the first 5-year plan, they were all summarily ended in 1932 with the party announcement, and then in 1934, and then onwards, first with the literary union and then the other arts unions, created into one big organization that was hyper controlled by government agencies. I think what ended in that period was simply the notion of independence. So even though these organizations become smaller and have less of a basic oppositional or different political view, amateurism on some level contains the possibility of criticism within it, I think, or the element of spontaneity within it. And I think that is what becomes intolerable to the Stalinist state, the element of spontaneity. So what happens in the 1930s is that amateurism continues, but it becomes a kind of proto-professionalism. So the amateur theaters that still exist, they have a very limited repertoire. They have much more oversight by professional organizations, and it becomes a much less spontaneous and free form of cultural interaction. And I see that as part of the ethos of the Stalinist period. Get rid of spontaneity in however it's possible to get rid of spontaneity, and the possibility of any kind of political criticism. So there are still amateur theaters in the 1930s, but they're very different places. I mean, they really, at this point, imitate professional theaters. They go back to stages, they have rehearsals, they have programs, they, you know, they're miniature professional theaters staffed by amateurs, and they're giving more or less the same repertoire as professional theaters. And that's very different than the kind of amateur theater that existed in the 1920s.
Do you think there's a, I mean, I don't know if this is a silly question really, a kind of a legacy from that time, from the Proletkult thing, in Russian culture or elsewhere? Did it have a kind of legacy, although it kind of diminished and went away? Did it have a kind of effect or influence other people in different movements, or not? It's just kind of very particular to its time, I suppose.
I think it is very particular to its time. I mean, I have to say, I don't know its reputation in Russia today. I'm not even sure if people still study it today, but when I was studying it, it was considered a very depressing topic by the Russians. They thought that all these people were just kind of wasting their time being silly, and they weren't serious, and they weren't trying to be professionals, and what was the point of it? And weren't they also anti-Leninist in addition to everything else? So I'm not sure that it has, I mean, I think within the Russian and then the Soviet political system, cultural activity maybe was always seen as a little more important than it is in a capitalist system, because it did have a kind of potential for protest against an overwhelming government, right? So
or standing things on their head, you know, with the workers at the bottom, trying to turn that out, you know, that not having culture.
Right, exactly. So you know, there was it didn't work very well, but there was a very strict censorship system in the pre-revolutionary period. I mean, the government paid a lot more attention to cultural utterances than they did in the United States, for example. But and I think maybe at least until the fall of the Soviet Union, you could see that in the Soviet system that also paid a lot of attention and paid a lot of money to cultural activities. Sponsoring these theaters and sponsoring many, you know, libraries everywhere. I mean, it was a very important, I mean, so the Soviet Union, by the time it ended, it might not be true anymore, was one of the most literate places in the world. And you couldn't go on a bus and not see, you know, half of the population reading a book. I mean, I'm sure this has all changed now, but at least, you know, it used to be, so it was a society that valued those markers of culture. You'd go into any Russian's home and they'd have the complete works of Tolstoy on the wall, or Chekhov, or Turgenev, or Lenin, or who knows, right? But there'd be some kind of display of culturedness, as the Russians called it, kulturnost, would be there to show you. So, I mean, that is something that, in a way, I wouldn't say it was a legacy of the Proletkult, but the Proletkult to some degree was a product of that, right?
I was just, I don't know if you've heard of this, right? Just there was talking about kind of I don't know, proletarian staging and all that kind of thing. So, you know, Alien, the film Alien. So has anybody heard of the bus drivers, British bus drivers put on their own play, a sort of stage play of Alien? I think it just did it in a village hall, and they made, it was quite funny, I saw they made the head, you know, the alien head out of papier mâché and all that sort of thing. So it was done all you know, in their way, sort of, and then people, they did it in the village hall or something, and then it went wrong, the costumes went wrong, so then they were improvising, everybody was laughing, so it became a comedy, and then somebody found out about it, and then they, you know, liked it, and then it got staged in the West End, you know, I mean, it's not like a long running hit, but it's,
no, there is something,
that was quite, you know.
There's I often thought of Proletkult, there is that British movie, it was sort of in the wake of, or during Thatcherism, there were all these movies about working class organizations that revitalized themselves by putting on a play or going to do you know, any of you know what I'm talking about? Going to some kind of music festival and everyone would get organized, and that always reminded me of Proletkult, that the workers would get together and put on, you know, some kind of show. And
so like this films like Brastoff.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, right. That reminds me of Proletkult. So coming out of the workers' tradition, right? I mean, probably more Proletkult than Proletkult actually really was, right?
Yeah. So my final question, I think all the rest have been covered. So in some of your other writings, you explore the appeal and influence of Russian theatre in America, whether that be method acting in Hollywood or living newspapers in the Federal Theatre project during the Great Depression. To what extent has theatre and the culture of revolutionary Russia provided influence beyond its sort of specific historical context? Which is sort of similar to the question that Iona was raising, but
I feel like in the world of theater, or at least in Western theater, Russia's had an amazing influence. I think that it's not just the Soviet Union, but it's Russian culture itself. So there's pretty much no aspect of theater that I think doesn't bear, at least to some degree, a kind of influence from Stanislavski or Meyerhold, for example, the two kind of different poles of the Russian aesthetic, Stanislavski being the method acting and Meyerhold being the kind of innovative attempts to use movement and break up the action and challenge the viewer. I mean, those two schools are tremendously influential. I guess Stanislavski is kind of leaving the scene, but certainly in the United States, at least until the 80s, it was still pretty much the dominant acting influence in this country. I don't know about your country.
Oh yeah, it was in America, yeah.
As far as the agitational theater, I think it had a huge influence, and I know just not just on American leftist theater, which, you know, the leftist theater in the United States was actually pretty small compared to other countries, but certainly in Germany and also in Britain, there were imitations of blue blouse, right? They would call them red blouse or whatever, or red shirt, or in the United States, many different groups were using translations of Soviet agitational plays. But the interesting one, so that's an obvious influence, but the interesting one is really the Federal Theater Project. And I think, I mean, I wrote an article on this, and I really think it's true that the entire Federal Theater Project was deeply, deeply influenced by the Soviet Cultural Project, not just living newspapers, which is the most obvious example. So the United States embraced in the Federal Theater Project regional theaters, which certainly the Soviet Union did. So it gave money to theaters outside of our three theater capitals of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, spread money all over the country to regional theaters. It also embraced ethnic theaters. So there was a German language theater, a Spanish language theater, a Yiddish language theater. I think even in Minnesota, things like a Finnish language theater. So that's something very much that the Soviet Union did. And it also created an African-American theater in the United States, which is, I see, copied from the Soviet Union's support of like Azerbaijani theater, Yiddish theater, the rest of it. So I think that Hallie Flanagan, the head of the Federal Theater Project, went to Russia twice. And I think that she was really deeply, deeply influenced by Soviet theater. Now, the obvious place is Living Newspapers, because she took the name Living Newspapers from the Russian theater. And she also followed the format to some degree. What was different was that they were heavily scripted. They were not, so Living Newspapers in the Soviet context were very ephemeral projects that were often created by groups, and the Living Theater in the United States were scripted. You can read the scripts. They have footnotes. You can follow the footnotes. So, you know, it came about in a different way, but I think that to some degree, the aesthetic intention was the same, to use varied forms. So in the Federal Theater Project, they really did use projections and things like that, interesting staging, to try to make contemporary information interesting. So there was a Federal Theater Project on milk prices. I mean, it sounds hilarious now, but I mean, they took housing was a big theme of one of their plays. So they took contemporary and what sounds like non-theatrical issues, issues directly from the newspaper and made them into drama pieces. And that comes right out of Russia.
I remember a story of the Living Theatre. They were putting on a production of The Brig, which is, you know, a big prison setup, and it's all about kind of, you know, the military kind of industrial complex, like kind of loosely in this kind of thing. And the police, the local police, actually came to arrest them during a performance of it. So they carried on essentially performing The Brig because what they were writing about was coming true to reality. So there does seem to be like, there's like there's like an accidental, spontaneous agitprop kind of aspect to that. What can't be planned.
Yeah, must have been fun to be there.
Well, they seemed amazing. I saw a documentary about the Living Theatre, and the founders of that were they, you know, they loved Artaud and all that kind of French kind of pre-postmodern kind of turn. But they were absolutely bonkers in the best way possible.
Yeah.
I suppose it's also like things like, you know, performance art and a lot of just that, a lot of the things that we would see under the sort of umbrella of avant-garde-ish stuff, really.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a general question about revolutionary political art movements and freedom. Do you think that it's difficult to sustain a revolutionary political art movement, no matter what it is, because there's a sense in which the politics always constrain the aesthetics, and the aesthetics always eventually become subservient to the politics? And that's maybe what explains why these things tend to be so short-lived and get subsumed under authoritarianism. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it may be particularly true in the Russian situation because, or the Soviet situation, because they thought their art was politics, right? I mean, they weren't trying to create, at least this is my understanding, a kind of art that was separate from the political sphere. They were trying to use it to help create the world that they wanted. And eventually the world that they wanted was subsumed in the process of creating the Soviet state, and there was just no room for them anymore. I mean, I think that, I mean, in some ways, you know, in my town, I could start a theater and do whatever I want, right? I could start a theater and talk about how we should assassinate Trump. Too late for that. Well, I guess we could still assassinate. And no one would care, right? It's sort of that the Soviet Union took art so seriously that they worried about its ability to undermine their project, whereas there's very, well, I mean, obviously there's censorship in the United States. I don't want to say that no one cares about anything, I would say, but for the most part, culture is considered a kind of an add-on, right? I mean, if you're a culture person, you go to the theater, and if you would rather watch football, you do that, right? I mean, it's not considered an absolute, essential, fundamental aspect of state life. I mean, we don't even have government-supported theater in the United States. I mean, it's nationally supported. It's all locally supported or unsupported at the moment. So I think in some ways it's a statement of how seriously the Soviet state took culture, that they decided that they had to subsume elements of experimentation and crush them. Because really, if you think about it, who cares what some factory circle is putting on about their local managers? I mean, that doesn't really undermine the Soviet state, right? But the Soviet state thought it could, right? Because if you start criticizing that manager, then why not the party leadership? And if you do that, then why not the state itself, right? So it's a sign of how important they thought it was. Now, can we ever have a socially just state that takes culture seriously and doesn't censor it? I don't know. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think, Greg?
Well, that's a difficult question. I suppose I would see justice and freedom as sort of parallel values that are important to try and maximize, while also taking into consideration the fact that sometimes you might have to sacrifice one little bit in favor of the other. But because I think that justice tends to happen naturally over time anyway, whereas freedom in the short run is very easy to take away from people, and that tends to create different calamities because freedom is an important part of peace, weirdly. I would tend to err on the side of freedom rather than creating immediate justices by limiting the freedom of artists.
Yeah, well, the Soviets didn't see it that way.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, definitely not. No, that's interesting. I mean, and if you think of it, I mean, you kind of wonder if it hadn't been so important to them, you know, if they could have continued with a kind of new economic policy kind of system, what would have happened? I mean, it's interesting to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what my concern with political art always is, regardless of whether it's in a capitalist country or a socialist country, is if you write or compose a work of art which is very political, there's always a sense that if it's too political, you kind of feel like, well, wouldn't it be better to just read an essay? Why am I reading this novel?
Yeah.
But I could read an essay which is the same thing.
And it'd be
in that
shorter.
case, is it actually art then, or is it propaganda?
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Well,
I've
I mean,
got,
I think most Soviets don't see that distinction.
that no,
They don't see,
I never saw it like that. You know what you're saying.
I mean,
is, sorry.
I think that some of the people in the early Soviet period were trying to bridge that divide, right? They were trying to say, this is propaganda or information or whatever, an essay, but we're going to try to make it fun, right? We're going to try to make it interesting to look at. We're going to try to make it challenging. So that's more fun than just sitting down and reading an essay, right? Or it's more social, or it's more engaging, right? It offers a different sensory experience than just sitting alone in your room and reading. So they were trying to kind of figure that out. So I'm going to sign off, you guys. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you so much for coming along and talking to us.
I had a really good time. Such great questions. It was really interesting, and I'll look at it again once you get the recording put back together. Yeah. Hope I don't sound too dumb.
No, I'm sure you don't sound great.
It was really fun. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Instagram, or Twitter. Exploding Appendix, Ideas and Culture.